Welcome back with a smiling face. Important note before starting, if you are a fan of audio stories, then our Patreon account is the best platform for you. Join us on Patreon for the best audiobooks ever. Luna's Resurgence. Episode 10. Chapter 60-64. Nick POV. He had royally this time. He could see it, the blood on her neck. She was never going to forgive him now. He'd lost control and nearly marked her. One weak moment and now she was practically hiding from him. Standing as far away from him as she could get. Nick had no idea what to say to her, didn't know how to deal with this. He was more than annoyed with himself. Thought he'd had better self-control. If he hadn't tried to mark her, had kept control of himself. Might have even been able to make love to her. Now it was all shot. He needed help and knew it. Just looking at her standing well away from him in the corner of the room, he knew she was waiting on having to defend herself from him, expecting him to stalk over there and take what he had tried to get from her. Any trust he had built was gone, there was now nothing left and he knew it. He'd obliterated it in one stupid weak moment. Nick called Mary for advice. She was a girl, surely would have something useful to tell him. He could hear that Lucinda was in the shower, and he left the suite while still talking to Mary, trying to give her some space for now, as Mary had advised him. Go and do your training and then come back to apologize and see if she was willing to sit down and talk about it. Mary thought Lucinda would understand once calmed down. She would know that he, being an alpha male, would have urges and needs that could take over where he was concerned with his need to mark and mate her, and that, yes, he was likely going to struggle with it at some times till she allowed it. She would understand, she was his mate and would give him the benefit of the doubt. Nick could only hope so. He didn't think it was going to be that easy, nothing ever was with Lucinda. The girl had her own set of rules and, like him, was big on respect. Mary had tried to cheer him up even a little, told him a very funny thing she'd seen at her conference and he had chuckled but only for a moment. Nick had asked when she was coming home. He wanted her to come home, was likely going to need her help, but she told him it would be at least another week. To his disappointment, he really did hate it when she was away from pack territory. Couldn't protect her out there, not that she needed it, she was an alpha-blooded female, that was mated to a highly ranked warrior. Nick had refused to allow her to go to his pack. That warrior had to come to them here in the Blue Moon Rising pack. It had been one of an argument. Jonah's alpha had not wanted to release the man and Nick would not willingly give his sister up to an unknown pack or man, for that matter, mate or not. Nick would not lose his sister, not after all they had been through in their lives. Mary, for once, had not argued with him about it, they had come across her mate by accident. When out, coming home from an alpha meeting, she'd opted to go with him on this occasion and he hadn't minded. They had been stopped for a meal break on the way home and so had another pack's alpha and few of his warriors. A fight had nearly ensued between him and Jonah when he'd tried to claim her, and Nick had gotten in the way of it. Mary had wanted to be with her mate, but had also not wanted to leave their pack or her brother for that matter. They were too close to be separated and he would not make her do something she didn't want. Nick had simply stated while standing between Mary and Jonah and his alpha, that their mate bond was over if he didn't agree to come to Blue Moon Rising pack. Mary had nodded sadly but agreed with him, leaving her mate completely bewildered. She had been about to voice her rejection to him when Jonah had realized she would actually go through with it. He'd come to his senses and halted her words and agreed to go with her, to join her pack instead of her going to his, which would have been the normal thing. Nick had made Jonah swear his allegiance to him right then and there in front of his own alpha to prove that he meant it. The man had. He really did want to be with Mary, his mate. They were still happy to date, a good pairing. Nick knew Mary was safe with Jonah. He'd put the man through a amount of training to see what he was made of, stood up to all of it. Proved himself to indeed be a highly ranked warrior. Was right there under Brady in the chain of command here in this pack. Ran border patrols when he was in the territory, did the rosters for it, trained the men and women that worked on the borders and was only not here when Mary was off doing her thing. Tattoo and piercing conferences or skill building, or competitions. He was a trustworthy and diligent man. Though a bit older than both of them, he was 34, 6 years older than Mary, but Nick could not fault the man's devotion to his sister. He was a great addition to the pack. It was no wonder his alpha had not been happy about losing him. Nick was not easy on his alpha unit this morning, training them harder than normal due to his mood. Needed to let out his own frustration from this morning's situation with Lucinda. He was going to have to apologize and pray to the goddess that Mary was right, that she would forgive him for his stupidity. Nick did know it was her choice, but he'd lost control. Even Rip had lost control, it seemed. Her response to him this morning in their bed had set off all of his primal needs to Mark and made her not just for him but for Rip as well. It had been all he'd been able to think about at one point. That was the error of his ways. He was not going to let it happen again. Couldn't let it happen again. Nicholas, a female voice shot down through the mind link, an urgent tone. No one called him Nicholas except for Samantha and Bella, Jeremy's granny. It didn't sound like Samantha. Bella. Yes, boy. You might want to get out here. Why? He inquired. A very large grey wolf, in a bloodlust is why. Grey that gained his attention instantly. He held his hands up to his unit to halt training completely. All grey boy. Stalked right past me, covered in blood and bits of whatever it had been out killing. I'm thinking it was your mate, boy. Never seen no wolf like that in this pack before. Really large, longish fur? Nick asked, praying she was wrong. But his gut was already twisting inside. Their morning had been shot and it could have two of them off. Kyra in a bloodlust, that was not going to be a good thing. Yes, boy. Now get out here, I don't relish dying today, and the link was severed. Nick stared at his men, they were all looking at him, his facial expression probably said a lot. He did not beat around the bush, boys. Kyra's gone all bloodlust out near Granny's cabin. Jeremy's head whipped up so fast Nick heard it crack. Granny. Fine, he said, heading off. Reported it to me. Bloodlust? Jeremy asked. Nick could hear the concern in his voice. Man, you're going to need tranquilizers. Kevin and Brady both snorted with laughter, but stopped when both he and Jeremy turned to look at them. Both of them suddenly realized Jeremy wasn't joking. Neither of them had seen Kyra yet, let alone her when angry. Nick could only imagine her in a full bloodlust mode. Bringing something down that crazed was not fun. Didn't usually go so well either. Sometimes it couldn't be done at all and the wolf had to be put down. Rip snarled at him inside his mind, our mate. Nick knew that, but these types of situations were never good. He knew she had trauma in her past. Had he triggered it this morning? He didn't know. Now a storm it seemed. One he had no idea how to handle at this point. Brady, go get the tranquilizers. It took 2 to take Kyra down in human form last time, might need 3 or 4 at this rate. Nick told him. One needs to be Wolfsbane. Jeremy yelled out as Brady shot off the mark, heading for the pack hospital to get the supplies needed and the tranquilizer gun. The seriousness of the situation was fully realized. What happened, Nick? Kevin asked. I don't know, he answered, pulling his clothes off to shift. "We'll need transport back." He looked at Jeremy and left the man in charge of organizing it. "Rip," he stated, and was shifted instantly to his wolf. Rip was tracking a trail of destruction, through the northern forest, small critters at first and then larger ones. He found a dismembered boar, and that big buck Nick had left alone all these years, a large and majestic creature, who'd been taking care of his herd all these years. Dead, with his throat ripped out and gutted, entrails all over the ground. Kyra, it seemed, was indeed in full bloodlust. This was not going to be good. Nick and Rip were both worried now. Could they talk her down? Neither one of them had any idea at this point. Had to figure out what set it off first. They could hear the fight that was going on before they could see it. It was very loud and very aggressive. Lots of growling and snarling going on. Cal and B were with Rip, Jeremy, and Kevin's wolves. Brady had announced through the mind link he was on the way, in Nick's Hummer once the situation was under control. Nick and Rip both thought this was a bit of an overreaction to him nearly marking her this morning. They knew she had been upset, had every right to be. But surely that wouldn't turn into a bloodlust-filled rage. Yelling and screaming, demanding to leave, maybe calling Alpha Corey, but not this. Finally, there she was, and of all things to kill was taking on a grizzly bear. An 8-foot beast of a bear. They could see she was injured. He could see claw marks on Kyra's side, down her back, what looked to be a massive bite across her shoulder. She was a mess, literally covered in her blood and the bear's blood. Watched with horror as Kyra launched herself after it yet again, the hit she had just taken not stopping her wounds, it seemed, not hindering her at all. Rip was running at full speed to get to her, to help her, saw her actually bring it down before they could get close enough to help, then saw her just start ripping into it, shredding its side with her claws and teeth. It was dead, and yet she had not stopped attacking it, was ferociously destroying it, gutting it right before his eyes. Bella was not wrong. Kyra was indeed in a bloodlust. "Nick?" Jeremy asked him, uncertainty in his voice. This was his Luna and he didn't know what to do about the situation. Well, he wasn't the only one. I don't know Jeremy, and he didn't. It didn't make all that much sense to him. Though he did recall Alpha Corey telling him if he forcibly marked or mated her, he would end up dead, mate or not. Perhaps, he thought now, he should have taken that more seriously. He knew he couldn't reach Kyra himself, not until they were marked and mated, neither could Rip. Nick doubted Lucinda was in control right this minute, but tried to reach her anyway. It was all he could do. "Lucinda, what's going on?" he asked her, genuinely worried about her, letting his worry and concern over her current state filter down the mind link. Although she did not answer him, he knew she had heard him. Kyra's whole body stilled, the destruction she was wreaking on that bear's dead carcass stopped. Then her big grey head lifted slowly. Her bright green eyes, locked right onto Rip, who was now standing still watching her, about 50 feet from where she was, a safe distance away. Even Rip knew better than to get close to a bloodlust-enraged wolf, even if that wolf was his mate. Space was required in case things went to hell. In her jaws was a mouthful of intestines, blood was covering her entire face, and dripping off of her teeth. Kyra snarled right at Rip. Oh yes, they were very mad. It was loud and aggressive, almost like she had been when faced with Darwin. This was not good. That anger and aggression was aimed directly at them. Her own mate. Her injuries and the blood coming from them didn't even seem to bother her, not hindered at all, as though she couldn't even feel them. Kyra opened her mouth and let the bear's innards drop. She stalked up on top of the bear, staring down Rip, growling menacingly at him the whole time. "Lucinda, calm down and tell me what's wrong. She screamed down the mind link at him, so much pain and anger shot into him through the link as she yelled her answer, "You cheating BD." His whole body was wrought with pain, her pain. There was so much pain and anger in those words he didn't understand it. Then the link was severed so violently that he thought his head was going to explode. It hurt to blazes, there was so much power behind her, strong and unchecked. Nick didn't even know that someone could sever a link he'd established, though he knew they could close it, not disconnect it the way she had. It was completely gone from him, nothing left for him to latch onto, to try and reach her. He couldn't reconnect with her either. She was blocking him completely. How that was possible he had no idea either. He was the alpha. She was a highly ranked warrior. She should not be able to do this, but somehow she could. Nick couldn't understand her words either. Cheating BD? Where had that come from? He'd not even looked at any other she-wolf since meeting her. Didn't want to either. Didn't want anyone else. He had told her that just the other night. He told her he would never hurt her like that, and he certainly hadn't. What was going on? He watched as Kyra stalked towards him, slowly, one step at a time. Rip was not happy. "I won't hurt our mate," he told Nick, and to Nick's own horror felt his own wolf abandon him, felt the first crack of his shift back to human form. "Rip, damn it! I can't take Kyra on without you," he yelled to his wolf, trying to call him back, tried to force him to stay, but couldn't, it seemed. He was left standing before Kyra in human form, before her very large, very aggressive, who had just taken down an 8-foot grizzly bear on her own and didn't seem to care about any of her injuries already sustained, so pumped full of adrenaline was she. "Boss," he heard Jeremy's worried voice at his sudden shifting. "Rip won't help, Kevin, your gamma powers would be good right now." He shot over to Kevin. "Can't do it in wolf form, boss, and would need to get close enough to touch her at that." "Brady," he called out, looking for backup. "Coming, boss, like a minute away." A lot could happen in 60 seconds. He'd not taken his eyes off of her yet, that was causing him a headache on top of the one she'd already given him with her overpowering him and his link to her. Trying to keep a clear vision and talk to his unit at the same time was never fun. "Why, boss?" Jeremy asked, keeping it short. They were all trying to communicate and watch her at the same time. Jeremy was the only other in his unit with the ability to keep his vision clear while talking, though he would pay for it later himself too. "Said I cheated." "What?" "I didn't," Nick informed him. Nick returned his full attention to Kyra. "I don't know what happened," he tried to tell her, trying to get her to understand he was not understanding them at all. Didn't know what she was talking about, didn't know why she thought he had cheated on her. But from the bloodlust he was seeing, the pain and anger he'd felt surging down the mind link at him. Nick did understand it was real to both of them. They believed it to be true without a doubt. Kyra was not placated at all. Had stalked down off the bear and was coming towards him. Nick knew that if he moved too quickly, it would set her off and she would charge him and a full-blown fight would ensue. Rip had fully retreated, he was still watching, but all his power and strength were gone, of no use to Nick. It was clear Rip was not going to hurt his mate even if she was him. He'd felt her pain and anger as much as Nick had. Rip was upset at her state and confused as to why, but he still wasn't going to hurt her. Kyra snarled at him. "Kyra, calm down, I didn't do anything." He tried the direct approach. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. This was not what he had been expecting from her. She stalked closer. Nick could only see one option. As the alpha he didn't like it, but it was a last resort, and with Rip not willing to assist, he had to bow down. He dropped down onto his knee, raised both hands up towards her, a symbol he didn't want to fight her, that she was in control and held all the power. If he couldn't get her to calm down and recede and give Lucinda back, it was going to be her versus his alpha unit. They would attack her. It was built into them to protect him. Please, Kyra, whatever it is, calm down. Give me back Lucinda. She took another step. He was not going to be able to reach her, heard Rip whine for his mate. Then he saw the dart land in her neck. Kyra's head turned to see where it had come from. Reload, he yelled down the mind link to Brady, knowing what Kyra was about to do. He had seen it with Alpha Corey. The minute her eyes landed on Brady, she was off like a shot to attack him. It was the exact same reaction. Kyra was not one to be attacked, in any way, it seemed. It didn't matter who her attacker was or what they were using. Any insult to her, she would take on head-on. Nick was up on his feet in an instant, watched the second dart, make her fall to the ground, but not knock her unconscious. She was already trying to get up, snarling at Brady. Goddess! Nick whispered to himself as he watched Brady stand his ground. He'd not moved as Kyra had run straight for him while he had reloaded and aimed at her a second time. She had fallen down just a meter from him, yet still he hadn't moved. Brady was now still standing right there reloading a third dart, and had yet to take his off of Kyra. This was the first time Brady and Kevin had seen Lucinda's wolf for themselves. Brady had stood his ground. Brave BD could have died if the second dart hadn't taken her down. He was curious as to how he'd kept his wolf coop at bay under such a threat. When she started to shift about 30 seconds later, Nick physically relaxed. He watched as Brady visibly relaxed too, took in a deep breath, looked right at Nick. She was going to kill you. Probably. Nick nodded. Left me. Wouldn't stay and fight. He explained his human form to them. That is a deadly game to play. Brady shook his head. It is, Nick agreed as he looked down at Lucinda's naked body. She was covered from head to toe in blood and bits of whatever she had killed. Her milky white skin was torn apart all over from wounds inflicted by the bear and probably that buck, maybe even the wild boar. Maybe Rip thought she would back off. I don't know. Wolf has gone quiet. He was more than angry with Rip and his behavior. They could have both died today and it seemed his wolf would have allowed it. He leaned down and checked her eyes. She was out completely, it seemed. Her wounds would not heal without Kyra and she was down due to the wolf's bane. Nick plucked the two darts out of her and handed them to Brady, then picked Lucinda's unconscious body up. She was actively bleeding still. Nick needed to get her to the pack hospital right away. How far is the car? Not far, a few minutes walk. Brady answered and pointed off in the direction he'd left it. Nick headed off right away. Heard Jeremy and Kevin shift back. What are you going to do, Nick? Jeremy asked. Nick knew he was referring to the fact that his own mate had been about to kill him. No alpha would stand for that, and if she had been a normal pack member and not his mate, he would have killed her himself for the attack on him. Get to the bottom of it was all he could say. Nick had no idea why Lucinda or Kyra, for that matter, thought he had cheated. He had gotten out of their bed, showered and gone straight to alpha training. Had not even seen a she-wolf, not touched one. And for her to believe he had for that amount of pain and anger she'd shot through to him, it was likely she had felt he had, but how? When he had not. They were all walking behind him. Kevin and Brady got in the front seats and Jeremy held open the car door for Nick and got in beside him. There was a blanket on the seat. Jeremy tossed it over Lucinda's naked body. Pack hospital now, he stated without hesitation. He looked down at her, could feel her wounds bleeding on him as he held on to her. They were all open and bleeding. He had no idea how much blood she had lost. He was watching as her skin started to bruise where she was not covered by the blanket. He could hear her heartbeat. It was steady. She was so strong. Nick. I don't know, Jeremy. He shook his head. I did not cheat. I don't even know why she would think it. Left our suite, went straight to training. He was staring at her. Her pain had been real to her, though that much he did know. You were off this morning. We all saw it. Different issue. Nick. Jeremy pushed. Nick knew he was in beta mode, trying to figure out why someone was trying to kill his alpha. He needed answers to try and solve the puzzle. Nick sighed heavily. He had been hoping not to discuss this for now, wanted to sort it out with Lucinda first. I nearly marked her this morning, without permission, he finally said. The whole car went silent. The rest of the ride to the Pack hospital was made in complete silence. They all knew that he wasn't allowed to do that, it was in his mating alliance. What the consequences for breaching it were too. One phone call from her to Alpha Corey and he would come and get her. Allow her to voice a rejection and force him to accept it. Or go to war over not handing her back. 61. Nick POV. He had to wait in the hospital for nearly 2 hours for her to be washed, cleaned, and have her wounds attended to by Dr. Emerson. His Pack doctor on duty this morning. One of his unit must have linked him. The man had been waiting in the hospital foyer, with a team of nurses and a gurney to take her away. Had looked right at Nick. I'll take good care of her, he'd told Nick, and encouraged him to place her on the gurney. Nick had actually not wanted to put her down, but knew he had to. He'd showered there in the hospital and been brought clean clothes by Brady. Prowled around outside the operating room, while Dr. Emerson tended to her injuries. He couldn't understand, no matter how hard he thought about it, there was no way she could have felt he had been with another, because he simply had not been. The nurses had offered him food and drinks, he'd waved them all away. In the end, they had left him be. Kevin was sitting watching him prowl back and forth, but had said nothing. Nick knew the man would have known what she was feeling, it was part of his gamma charm, something he could use to help calm her down when needed. Even Nick understood why he hadn't attempted to use it today. Risking his life for a bloodlust-filled creature, that would turn on him the moment he moved to touch her, was not on his list of duties. Nick had only asked him in the hope that he could do it in wolf form. He'd looked at Kevin a few times, the man had looked right back at him. Nick wondered if Kevin actually thought he had touched another. But the man was silent on the subject. Would talk when he was ready, Nick supposed. If the Pack got wind of it, they would all presume he had, going off her reaction and with his family's history, what more could he expect from them? He had told her of his family history. Told her he would never do that to her. Yet she still believed he had. Who had told her something, shown her something? Maybe there was more to it. Maybe she was still concerned that he would cheat, and therefore had been easily swayed by another. Nick had no idea. If someone had interfered with his bond with his mate, that was breaking his number one rule and they were a dead wolf. He would invoke the law he had put down to protect bonded wolves. Even if he and Lucinda weren't marked and mated, everyone in this pack knew she was his goddess-gifted mate. Therefore, not to interfere with their bond. Now he stood by her bedside, looking down at her. She was wearing a hospital gown, had been patched up, over 80 stitches and staples to various parts of her body. She had wounds all over her body, wound dressings covering most of her back, from where that bear had ripped into her, dressings down the left side of her ribs and across her abdomen, down her left leg and both arms, and several across her right shoulder where she had been bitten by that bear. He was listening to Emerson list out her wounds. Then, when there was silence in the room, looked to the man who'd asked what had happened to her. Bear was all Nick said. No other questions were asked. It was clear from her wounds it was a large animal attack and the marks on her back would be consistent. Heck, all her wounds would be consistent with a bear. The man had touched the two obvious injection sites and glanced at him. Had to was all he said. Emerson stared at him for a long time, then told him she would be fine, bruised and battered for a while, a few days in all likelihood. Would heal up nicely once she got her wolf back. Had told him due to the amount of wolf's bane in her system. Clearly tested it. She wouldn't wake up until 6 or 7 p.m. Probably take her wolf to heal her fully, about 2 days. But for now the stitches and staples were doing their job and the dressings were protecting her wounds from infection. She'd likely be in some pain when she woke up, may or may not need pain relief. That would be up to her, and her pain tolerance. Nick wondered about that himself. Her wounds had not slowed her wolf down, didn't seem to bother her at all. Tolerance to pain was probably high, he thought. He, on the other hand, had already taken pain relief, to get rid of the migraine she had caused him when severing that link to him. Was still curious as to how she could do it. How he had felt so much power come from her. It was odd. He had not marked or mated her yet, so her Luna abilities and the power he would pass to her, should not be affecting her, but it was almost as if they were already in effect. His head hurt from all the questions rolling around, that he had no answers to. Nick was not looking forward to her waking up and going him again. She would not likely be able to shift due to her wounds, and she should come around a few minutes before Kyra did, or at least he was hoping so. Or it was likely he would come under attack again. Nick needed to find answers before she woke up, needed to be able to prove to her, he had not done anything wrong. And in order to do that, he had to know what had set her off in the first place. Twice now he'd seen her wolf in a full-blown rage. It was not pretty and getting her under control was obviously an issue. It had taken Alpha Corey's entire unit, plus her retrieval team to contain her last time along with Jeremy. 9 wolves to contain one. She looked so small and helpless, lying there on the hospital bed, but her wolf was anything but small and helpless. Alpha Corey had told him, Lucinda had said, Kyra had told her, she needed to be strong enough before she could come out. That bothered him greatly right this minute. What sort of wolf was she? Her coat was longer than an average wolf, and her claws were longer and razor sharp from what he'd seen and felt. Kyra, he noted, also had amazing control of Lucinda's body, able to pop her claws out at will, in human form, and not always all of them. At dinner the other night, just one under his chin from what he recalled. Not something a normal wolf could do. Not even he and Rip could do that. His mate was not a normal wolf. He needed to do some research, it seemed. Nick left Kevin with her in the hospital room. The man seemed okay with it, in fact. Just nodded and made himself comfortable on small sofa in her hospital room. Go figure it out, boss, was all he'd said. Nick found Jeremy in his office, sitting in his chair, using his computer. It wasn't the first time he'd seen it. Jeremy was his beta and the man had access to everything and was his second in command. When Nick was off without him, a rarity, but it did happen, Jeremy sat in his chair and took control of the pack. Could run the pack with as much authority as Nick did. They had the same set of values. That was why they got along, why he had chosen Jeremy as his beta. Jeremy was just a little more laid back and fun than Nick was. But his display of power the day he'd killed his brother had warned everyone he was just as strong as Nick was. Nick was the only one able to take Jeremy down, and he had to use brute force to do it. The man was tougher than his mischievous person belied. Nick walked over to his desk. Jeremy didn't even move, he had accessed the security cameras for the pack house. I got nothing, Nick. Jeremy shook his head. You went from your suite, right to training, with us at the training grounds. I already told you, I did not cheat. Nick stated. He knew Jeremy wasn't judging him. Knew Jeremy would have believed him, taken him at his word. It was simply restating a fact. He leaned back in Nick's chair and looked up at him. Then Nick, what is it? What happened? I don't know, but I can tell you, when I tried to talk to her, Jeremy. She screamed at me and right down the mind link she shot all her pain and anger, near ripped me apart. What she was feeling was very real to her. He touched his chest as it started to ache. Just thinking about her in that much pain was causing him pain. Their bond was strong even now, after this he could still feel hurt knowing she was in pain. Did she talk to anyone? He asked Jeremy. Jeremy shook his head and turned his attention back to the camera system. There were currently 6 feeds frozen on the screen. Look, I have you here. Leaving your suite, he touched the screen that showed the alpha hallway and covered his suite's bedroom door. Then here, like 25 minutes later, he allowed Nick to see his bedroom door literally fly off and hit the other side of the hallway, see Lucinda come out and pick it up and throw it down the hallway. Before running completely naked through the pack house and outside via the dining room. That is Kyra, Nick stated. He noticed her eyes were glowing green the whole time. So what happened in that 25 minutes, Nick? Nick shook his head. He didn't know. There were no cameras in the suite. Maybe he should fix that? But then anyone who had access to the security system could see anything he and her did in their suite. None of the suites had cameras, privacy granted in everyone's home. The public areas all covered. Have you gone up to the suite yet? Nick asked. No, thought it best to wait for you, you'd know if something was out of place. Let's go look at it. They took the stairs, could see all the claw marks Kyra had left in her wake to be out of the pack house. The treads all marred, the hand railings all scratched up. Damaged everything in her path, destruction wrought wherever she went. They went and picked up the door to his suite, a fully reinforced door at that, double-hinged and secure with 3 automatic locking mechanisms. Nothing was supposed to be able to get through it. But Kyra had destroyed it in her rage. There were marks on the door from where she had repeatedly slammed into it from the inside. The hinges had given way, it seemed, under the violent force of her attack on it. Sweet goddess Nick. I know, Jeremy, he nodded. We need to look into her, Wolf. I don't think she is normal, something going on there for sure. I'll have Quincy rehinge it, but man, you need to replace the whole door. Yeah, and there will be no locking her in, ever. Why would you want to? Jeremy frowned at him. Contingency plan, if Darwin turned up is all. Nope, that ain't gonna work. Jeremy agreed. They leaned the door up against the hallway wall and Nick walked into the suite to look around. It looked completely normal to him, no destruction here at all, just the door, probably not enough sense in her rage to actually turn the door handle was all. He walked into the bedroom. He knew she hadn't gotten dressed because she'd left the suite completely naked. The towel was lying on the floor not far from the bathroom door. He turned and looked around, frowning. Besides claw marks on the door frame between the bedroom and living area, there was also no destruction in here. But obviously she had full control, leaving this room. He had not seen them last night when he'd come in here, and he had noted the chair was missing, so he would have noticed them. So they were fresh. Anything? Jeremy asked. He was looking around, but other than the bed, still not made, there was nothing. It was Sunday and Samantha would not come today. No Omegas worked on Sundays. Nick sighed, he didn't think so. He turned slowly and looked at everything, stopped at the bedside table. Her phone was not docked in the charging station where it always was. Her phone is missing, he pointed to the docking station. They both started looking for it. She certainly didn't have it on her. Had to be here in the room somewhere. It took several minutes to find it, lying under the curtain by the window, smashed. She had likely thrown it at the wall. There was glass on the floor. Jeremy attempted to turn it on, but no luck. She'd broken it. Our tech guy might be able to retrieve something. Do it. Nick, it's the same as your phone, switch the SIM cards and let's see if we can get anything from it first. Might not want, Nick nodded, retrieved his phone and switched out the SIM cards. It turned on, but there was nothing there, just one call to Gabby right before she bolted from the room, it seemed. Nick sighed, not enough to go on, could have called to see how the twins were doing. Could have called Gabby, for rescue. If she thought you were cheating, might have called for help before losing it. Great, if that's the case, Alpha Corey will be calling or on his way already. You want me to prepare for the worst? Nick rubbed a hand over his face. No, even if he comes, he's not taking her, till I find out what happened and can prove my innocence in the matter. We'll house him and whoever he brings, call a treaty till we can hear what she has to say, I guess. Might come charging in. Jeremy worried. We'll stand down, show him we don't want to fight. All right. It's been how long since that call? Nick checked the time, 3 hours. It's a 5-hour drive. He'll have to pull his alliances together first, that will take 2 hours at least. We got time, Jeremy? Nick sighed, he didn't know. Looked at their bed and turned away. The cause of this storm started there. Nick, go over everything for me, every detail. Don't leave anything out, no matter how small. Jeremy prompted him. Not in here. Nick muttered and walked out of the bedroom. Jeremy followed him. He knew what Nick had done in that bed and didn't say anything about it. It was a completely different matter. Something he was going to have to deal with after they sorted this out. Nick sat on the lounge, rubbed his hand over his face again. I got out of the bed, after, nearly. Lucinda was understandably upset, stood in the corner of the room away from me. I wasn't all that happy myself, very annoyed at myself. Showered, dressed. Called Mary for advice and then left the suite to go train with you and the boys. Jeremy was standing there staring at him, a frown on his face. Pondering, Nick thought. Did she see you call Mary? He finally asked. No, was in the shower. Why? Nick watched as Jeremy paced about for about a minute, then his eyes moved right to Nick's. Nick sighed. He knew what was coming. You told Mary you loved her, didn't you? Jeremy commented. Yes, Nick nodded, I always do. Took in a deep breath and closed his eyes. She heard me say the words, I love you, sweetheart. Nick just knew that had to be it. Jeremy nodded. I'd say so. Nick, I've heard you talk to Mary a million times. When you tell your little sister you love her, it's conveyed in your tone. Indeed, Jeremy sighed. A misunderstanding. All that rage for a misunderstanding. She is still going to be in that rage when she wakes up, Nick, Jeremy reminded him. Nick could only nod his head, he knew that, because she didn't know he'd been talking to his sister. Well, at least now he could prove his innocence in the matter. That would help with her and Alpha Corey. Nick, "You're not going to like this, but I suggest putting silver cuffs on her. Until you explain it to her, Kyra might just rip right out of her all over again." Jeremy was right. He didn't like it. Wasn't going to do it either, that would not engender trust at all. But he might just keep some handy. "You're right. I don't like it. I see your point." He stood and shook his head. "But I don't like it. I will take them but not use them, unless necessary." Jeremy nodded. He understood that using silver cuffs on one's mate was not a good idea. 62. Nick POV. Now that he understood what had happened, to set both Lucinda and Kyra off, into her rage, both he and Rip were a bit more settled. Not that he or his wolf had spoken to each other, since Rip had abandoned him, to likely die at Kyra's will. Nick left Jeremy in charge of organizing the place, getting fixed up and organizing to have the sweet store put back on and a new one ordered. Left him in his office. He knew Jeremy would fill in Kevin and Brady so they could understand what had happened as well, and would need to, seeing as they had all been witnesses to their Luna's bloodlust. Not something he ever wanted to see again, and Nick was certain neither did they. He returned to the hospital to sit with her, was watching her sleep. He'd relieved Kevin of his duty to watch her. Kevin had pat him on the back as he'd left the room. "It'll be all right," he'd reassured him. Which meant Jeremy had already relayed the truth of the matter to him. Nick just nodded. On his way through the hospital, Nick saw Valerie was on shift now. Had requested that she stay away from the Luna, after the way she had greeted him when he'd arrived. That hadn't gone down so well. When he had walked through the hospital heading for Lucinda's room, Valerie had smiled right at him, a little on the seductive side, and then asked how he'd been, tried to strike up a conversation with him. He had seen the way she was looking at him, all sweet-like, batted her eyelashes at him even. When she had tried to touch his arm, he'd shot her look that showed his displeasure with her, and her coming on to him, which he knew she was doing. "I have a mate," he'd told her flatly. She'd actually giggled at him. "Oh, I know," she'd said like it didn't matter, then landed her hand on his arm and run her fingers along it. He'd brushed her off abruptly, glaring at her. He had the distinct impression this one she-wolf was going to cause trouble between him and Lucinda. When or how he didn't know, but even Rip was seething at her actions right now. They had rules for a reason. Not once had Valerie attempted to report his mate's, her Luna's, condition to him. So he had asked her directly and, to his utter dislike, she had waved a hand in the air dismissively and stated in a bored, uncaring tone, "Oh, she's fine," and then wandered off. Nick heard her ranting at Emerson about him not trusting her to do her job. That she was a professional and could separate her personal issues from her work issues. Nick had not particularly cared for her attitude. There should be no issues between her and Lucinda. As the Luna of the pack, Valerie should be showing respect at all times. But he'd not seen her once do that. He and Rip did not want her anywhere near Lucinda. Had reported this to Emerson. But Valerie had stalked past Lucinda's room, where she was currently unconscious still, every 20 minutes like clockwork. He didn't like it. Was going to have to pull her into line. He also was not about to go and leave Lucinda alone, with that she-wolf prowling around out there for goddess only knew what reason. His attention returned to Lucinda. More bruising had appeared on her body now. She was a wounded mess and he didn't like it. Couldn't do anything about it. Wanted to try and get some work done but just couldn't leave the room. There was nothing he could do till she woke up. He knew that logically, but still he couldn't leave the room. Wanted to be here when she woke up. He couldn't think straight anyway. Even just trying to think about pack-related issues that needed his attention, he couldn't focus on them, his thoughts always moved back to Lucinda. so he was just sitting next to her bed watching her sleep. He'd asked Emerson more than once about her condition, couldn't seem to help himself. Emerson didn't seem worried or bothered about Nick's constant mind-linking to ask him the same question every 15 minutes or so. Just reassured him she would be fine. Valerie was supposed to be being kept away from the room, but Nick knew even that wasn't going so well. The woman had just passed by and looked in through the door window. Oh, she was asking to be locked up. It was more than starting to tick him and rip off. Boss. Yes, Jeremy. Alpha Corey just called. Seems a bit on the ticked off side. Demanding to speak with you. Here it was, the fallout of the misunderstanding. It was nearly lunchtime. The man had had plenty of time to start pooling his resources for an all-out scale war on Nick's pack. Preparing for it all morning, Nick guessed. Did you tell him I was busy? I told him you were out of the office. Didn't seem to care. Demanded you ring him back within 10 minutes or, and I quote, he's coming here and not alone. Nick sighed and rubbed his hand over his face. I need someone to stay with Lucinda. The whole time knew Lucinda had called Gabby for retrieval. I'll send Brady. I'm not leaving till he gets here. Nick. Valerie is acting really weird, prowling around. I don't trust her, Jeremy, something is off. I'll let both Kevin and Brady know. Kevin walked in the door a few minutes later and he noted Brady was standing on the outside of the door, both of them. Good. When he stepped out of the room he looked right at Brady pointedly. She won't get anywhere near the Luna boss. Nick nodded. He knew Brady would not slack in his duty and neither would Kevin, for that matter. The minute Nick walked into his office, Jeremy was dialing the phone, trying to avoid an all-out war. Nick guessed, not that he thought it would come down to it now he knew what had happened. The line connected on the second ring. Nicholas, what is going on over there? He demanded, the alpha tone flowing right down the line. Explain to me why you're calling and I can probably answer you. Nick snapped back, even though he knew the reason for the call. He had had a very rough morning with Lucinda and was in no mood to take crap from anyone, not even Alpha Corey. He also didn't like that this phone call was pulling him away from his mate. When she needed him to be with her, even if she didn't know it, or wanted it right now. Did you cheat on Lucinda? He was asked directly, no beating about the bush, right down to the point. Still his alpha tone flowing. Seems the man had a very serious side after all. No, Nick replied calmly, she had not only called but told Gabby why. I haven't been able to reach her. She smashed her phone. Nick answered honestly. I want to hear it from her, Nicholas. Well, you'll have to wait on that, considering she is unconscious in my pack hospital. What happened to her? He demanded to know. It's been a rough few hours. Did she call you? Gabby. Nicholas, she claimed a lot of bad things about you. Begged Gabby in tears, to have me come and get her. I could not in good conscience ignore her plea. He sounded a little calmer to Nick. Why don't you start at the beginning? Tell me what she reported to Gabby and I will do my best to explain what I can. You can judge for yourself as an alpha. If my actions as an alpha were too harsh, they did have a mating alliance and Lucinda was now considered Alpha Corey's daughter and, seeing as they were not marked and mated yet, he did have to explain himself. But he had just informed Alpha Corey he was expected to listen as an alpha, not a father, not a friend, and judge his actions according to what he himself would do, as an alpha, under the same circumstances. A little loophole in the contract. There was a long silence from Alpha Corey. Nick wondered if the man was angry or impressed by Nick's not-so-stupid request. He'd pretty much given Alpha Corey everything he'd wanted in the alliance, looked a bit like a pushover, but Nick had simply been trying to get it sorted out quickly to have Lucinda home with him. "Have you stopped her from training?" His voice was calm and there was no alpha tone coming down the line. "Yes, she goes way too far with her training, to the point of exhaustion. I won't allow her to drown in my pool because she does not know when to stop." "Fair enough, I've never actually been able to stop her either on that one." He was at least in agreement with Nick about that one. Nick now knew from just that one question that Lucinda had likely told Gabby about all the punishments she'd received, but left out why he'd stopped her from doing things. "Did you confiscate her bow and lock it away?" "Yes, I did. As punishment for leaving pack territory to go hunt out in rogue territory after I specifically told her to stay inside the pack, outright disobeyed me." He heard Corey sigh, and his alpha hearing also picked up the man shaking his head. "You forcibly bled her into your pack then?" "I did, after the rogue territory incident, right after I confiscated her bow. So I could keep track of her. She would have been initiated into my pack anyway, in a day or two. I just pushed it forward was all," Nick stated calmly. He had answered every question with valid alpha reasons. Heard Alpha Corey sigh again, more heavily, didn't know if he was in agreement with Nick on that one, but there was no yelling or alpha aura pouring down the line. The cheating Nick, why would she think that? Nick thought, well, we seem to be on better terms, gone from formal to non-formal. That I'm still yet to discuss with her. Can only put it down to that she must have heard me on the phone with my sister Mary. I told Mary, I love her. It's all I can think of. We have checked the footage from when I left the suite to when she left the suite. No one in or out. So can only be that. A misunderstanding which I will clear up as soon as she wakes up. Why is she unconscious?" It was Nick's turn to sigh now and it came out heavy. Kyra went on a bloodlust rampage through the pack's northern forest, took down many animals, but then decided an 8-foot grizzly bear was a good target. Was very badly injured. Once she was finished with that bear, she tried to take me down. Was sedated to stop the rampage. I did not want to do it. I tried to talk to her, tell her I didn't understand what was going on. She would not listen to far gone. Right, when is she due to wake up, son? His voice sounded more like the Alpha Corey he'd met in Half Moon Pack. Around 7 p.m. my pack doctor informs me. I want her to call me no later than 8 then. You do understand why, right? Yes, and Nick did. The man still wanted to hear it from her. I'll have her call you, if she can stay calm long enough, for me to explain to her it was my sister I was talking to. If not, I'll call you and you can come here yourself and talk to her. Good, and agreed. Then the line disconnected. Nick put the phone down. Jeremy was just shaking his head, had used his wolf's hearing to listen to the entire conversation. Nick was pretty sure Alpha Corey had his whole unit, his Luna and Gabby in that room. They would all have been wanting to know what was going on over here. Lucinda had gone right ahead and told Gabby all about the punishments he'd dealt out to her, but not the reasons why, or what she had done to incur said punishment. Dumped him in a heap of trouble. Could have started a war if Alpha Corey had just taken her word for it and rushed over here to get her back as she'd requested. Seemed the man did have a solid head on his shoulders. Nick. It's fine, Jeremy. She will just have to call and explain herself to Alpha Corey. After we have our chat. Nick returned to the pack hospital. Brady was standing by the door as Nick had left him. No one in. He nodded to Nick. Good. I will need to have a serious word with Valerie, I think. Oh, she is in trouble. Tried to go in, something about taking blood from the Luna. What? That confused Nick. Why would anyone need to take blood from her? She had already lost a lot of blood. Had been infused a pint during her wound care. Yet, said Dr. Emerson needed it. So I asked him. He did not order any blood to be taken. I never let her past the door, boss. Where is she now? He frowned. This was now a real problem. I relieved her of her duties and told her, if she tried to come anywhere near the Luna again, I would toss her into the cells. What is wrong with her? I don't know, boss, but, great, there was more. What? I checked the library footage after our conversation about the Luna, overhearing people say horrible things about you. It was Valerie that Lucinda overheard. Nick's anger spiked. Do you think on purpose? Yes, by the looks of it. I'll get the footage ready for you to see for yourself. I want that she-wolf in my office first thing in the morning. Sure thing, Nick, I will gladly see to it myself. Nick saw Brady's eyes move to Lucinda. Through the window. She's going to be all right, isn't she, boss? There was a hint of worry in his voice. Emerson thinks so. Nick nodded. Good, I like her. A lot like Jeremy, going to be a handful for you. But fun for us. Nick shook his head. I see it too, and he did. When she was in a good mood she was wonderful, ticked off now, that was a nightmare. He stepped into the room and relieved Kevin of his duty as well. Valerie, it seemed, had a lot of explaining to do. If she was trying to interfere with his bond with the Luna, he was going to severely punish her. He had rules in place for a reason. Especially this one. He made a mental note of all of Valerie's interactions with Lucinda that he knew of, right from the day she had arrived in his pack. Breakfast, the training ground, the pack library, and now here in the pack hospital. Trying to get Lucinda's blood. Why would anyone want to do that? On every occasion Valerie had antagonized or gone to Lucinda, not the other way around. He couldn't understand the woman or her thought process, who was stupid enough to risk the punishment on rule number 1. Especially where it was the Alpha and Luna bond involved. 63. Nick POV. Nick sat there all afternoon, just watched her. She didn't so much as move a single muscle, her eyes didn't flicker, she did not dream. He could see the slow and steady rise and fall of her chest. She was attached to a heart monitor, purely precaution, he supposed. He could detect her heartbeat, it was as steady and strong as it always was. Even when she had been actively bleeding from all her wounds. Her heartbeat had been strong and steady. Not once had he detected even the slightest weakness or compensation from her heart to try and pump her blood around her body, to keep her alive while she had been bleeding out. Every hour, like clockwork, her nurse, a young she-wolf with brown curly hair and brown eyes, and a very round belly, about ready to give birth, Nick thought, came into the room and took a set of vitals, smiled down her, pat her hand gently and informed her she was going to be all right. Then nodded to him and left the room. He wondered if she knew she was having twins. His hearing had picked up 3 heartbeats, hers and her 2 babies. If not, he wouldn't spoil it for her. A nice little surprise. A sweet-dispositioned she-wolf, if ever he saw one. She was wearing a name tag that read Hope. She was definitely where she belonged, working here in the pack hospital, looking after people seemed to be her calling. Nick got up and strolled around the room to stretch his legs, stopped to glance out the window and nearly snarled out loud, found Valerie looking right at him. From up the road a piece, she smiled and waved at him. Nick turned away without acknowledging her, she-wolf just didn't take the hint. Brady, he snapped down the mind link, and couldn't keep his irritation out of his voice. Boss! Retrieve Valerie now. She is standing just up from the hospital looking at Lucinda's room from outside. A snarl came down the line, very angry it sounded, and then he was gone. Nick turned and watched as Brady stormed out of the pack house, had a clear view from here. The front door banged open and closed behind him. Valerie's head whipped around and looked right towards Brady. Then she turned and looked right at Nick. Seemingly confused about why she was suddenly in trouble, staring right at him, he watched as she tried to run towards the hospital, towards him. Nick closed the link on her the minute she tried to establish one with him. He did not care about whatever she wanted to say to him. Brady had sprinted after the minute she had moved. He now had her, she was yelling and screaming at him, as he dragged her away. Nick turned away from the scene. Dropped the blind in the room. She was definitely an issue that was in need of sorting out. Though Brady seemed more than happy to sort her out, that was a curious thing in itself. A night in the cells, boss. Till the sun goes down, will do. I still want to see her in my office in the morning. She will need to explain her behavior. A night boss would be best. Learn a lesson. Nick thought about it, looked at his mate lying in the bed defenseless. She had tried to come in here and take Lucinda's blood. All right, he agreed. On it, I'll escort myself. Nick blinked at the man's reaction, but let it go, he could question him later, he supposed. Nick sank back down in the chair next to her bed, reached out and touched her hair. It had been plaited to one side to keep it from getting in her wounds, he supposed. Black like Rip, he realized, with a slight blue sheen to it just like Rip's fur in the sunlight, so soft and silky to touch. He sat and ran his fingers through her hair, much like she had done to him just last night. To comfort him. He sighed softly. Rip was still quiet, had been all day. Only rousing and becoming agitated when Valerie was around. Not even his wolf was comfortable with her around, didn't like her being near his mate either. Something was definitely off about that she-wolf. Kyra was so very strong, he'd never seen anything like it, in a female warrior, regardless of how highly ranked. Nor had he seen a wolf with her temperament. For that matter, wanting to take on an alpha wolf, had taken on a bear without regard to her own safety. She had wanted a piece of that alpha wolf Darwin, and Nick was starting to wonder if a piece she would have gotten. Now that he had seen with his own two eyes, just how fierce she truly was. So much strength in such a tiny woman. Had to wait until she was strong enough for what? Nick wondered. She was strong. Trained so darn hard for years, why? To take on an alpha wolf, he thought. Sitting looking down at Lucinda, he realized wolf or not, Lucinda would likely have challenged Alpha Darwin even without Kyra. Kyra hadn't been around for his and her altercation, whatever it was. She had trained for hours and hours for years to prove herself, waiting for the chance to have a shot at that man in all likelihood. He was never going to be able to stop her, he realized. If the man wandered past or she saw him, there was nothing Nick or Rip were going to be able to do about the battle that would ensue. Though Nick wondered if Kyra would lose, after what he saw today, he doubted it. He and Rip had lived here with those bears, not even he took them on. He kept his pack members clear of the north end of the pack, and all border patrols out there wore tranquilizer guns to aid in protecting themselves from the bears. He lifted his head as he saw the first sign of movement from Lucinda. She drew in a deep breath, let it out and rolled onto her right side away from him. It was her less injured side, and she was likely, moving on instinct to get away from the pain of her injuries, her back mostly. Nick stood and looked down at her. Everything went back to as it was, calm and steady breathing. Nil eye movement. He checked his watch, only 5 p.m., still 1 or 2 hours before she was properly awake. He could feel Rip pushing at him to get closer to her. He didn't like that Kyra was missing, but did appear to understand it. Whined a little inside Nick's mind. Nick actually felt sadness wash over his wolf. Sighed softly and slid into the bed behind her. He too wanted to be closer to her. Rested an arm around her waist gently, careful of her wounds, and lay there, closed his eyes and just listened to her breath. His presence didn't affect her at all. She was still out completely, and unable to detect him next to her at that point. Hope strolled in on cue, and smiled at him after taking in the fact that he was in the bed with her. Took Lucinda's set of vital signs, looked at Nick. "She'll wake up soon, Alpha." He just nodded. A part of him had expected her to admonish him for crawling into the bed with her, but she hadn't. Looked like it was something she had been expecting to see. Didn't faze her in the least, or even stop her from doing her job, had just moved on around him. Though took off the heart rate monitor, he noted. Guess her getting ready to wake up probably didn't need it. "You should get some rest, Alpha," she'd said as she walked out the door. Nick didn't even know if he could rest with Lucinda as injured as she was. He leaned forward and kissed the top of her head and closed his eyes, breathed in her scent and tried to relax. It had been one very long and stressful day. For both of them, and he knew, it was not over yet. A snarl woke him, as did the sudden movement on the bed. She was awake and fully so. Nick pulled her against him when he realized she was trying to get away from him, locked his arm around her and just held on tight to her. This was now a fight they had to have to get her to listen to him. He did not want to aggravate her wounds any further than they already were, but he had a better chance of controlling the situation if she was still in the bed and locked to him. Then he would if she was able to get off the bed and take a full swing at him. She might be tiny, but she was strong even without her wolf. He'd learned that the hard way. Last time she had been angry with him. "Calm down. I did not cheat on you," he told her, keeping calm himself. There was no point in him being mad about the situation, and he wasn't, not really. It was a misunderstanding and he just had to clear it up and get her to believe him, and the only way he was going to do that was by staying calm and in control of the situation. This he had much practice with, came with being an alpha and having to deal with the crap that ticked him off, but needed to stay calm to sort out other packs and their alphas usually. But a skill he had mastered. She was really struggling against him now, kicking at him. Nick clamped a leg over both of hers to completely pin her body to his. He was risking it if Kyra decided to rise up and have a piece of him. She would likely get it with him being this close. But he had no choice. Held on to her firmly and let her struggle as much as she wanted to against him. He was not letting her go. He could already hear the sobs coming out of her. She did not believe him. She was struggling to get away from him with all she had, though he didn't feel Kyra's presence at this time. Either her wolf was still asleep or too injured to help her. "Enough, Lucinda, I did not cheat on you," he told her firmly. Still, the struggling against him did not stop, but he had a good grip on her. For once, he was thankful for his very large hands that were wrapped around both her wrists, pinning them to her chest. He was also thankful that she was so darn tiny against him. Made it easier to pin her down now that he had hold of her. "You love someone else? Just go be with them and let me go." Nick closed his eyes, tried to steel himself against what he could hear, all the pain in her voice. It laced every single word. She felt hurt and betrayed by him, it was clear. "I do not love anyone else," he told her truthfully. "Liar," she screamed at him. "I heard you tell them," she sobbed. Her whole body, though still struggling against him, was racked with sobs at the same time. "It was my little sister. I called her while you were in the shower. My sister Mary. Lucinda, I needed advice, after what I did to you, nearly marking you, he explained to her as best he could. She was at least listening to what he was saying. He knew because her struggling against him ceased finally. It took another minute for her to turn her tear-filled eyes up to him. She was still sobbing, there was still doubt in her expression, but he could see a part of her wanted to believe him. Watched as tears still spilled down her face, his heart ached just looking at her, knowing he was the cause of her pain. Her fighting him had stopped completely now, and he released her slowly from his grip, eased her onto her back gently, knowing it was covered in wounds and stitches. She didn't seem to feel the pain. He wanted her to be able to look up at him properly, see his face, read his expression and see he was genuine with her. You can ask her yourself. Check my phone call log if you want to. I told you we were very close, and yes, I told her, I love her. She's my little sister. You can understand that bond, right? Nick asked softly, looking right down at her, knowing she would understand it. She had twin sisters that she loved as much as he loved Mary. Had seen it for himself. Heard the heartbreak of having to leave them. He really wanted to wipe away those tears from her face, but didn't want to risk touching her at this point, needed to get her to believe him, to calm down fully. He saw her nod slowly that she understood what he was saying, her sobs were still racking her body. He looked down at her for a while, hoping she would calm down. I'm sorry, Lucinda, that you thought I would do that. He risked brushing some of her hair away from her face, hoping it wouldn't back-spiral her into the pain she had felt, had thought he'd done to her on purpose, prayed his touch wouldn't cause her pain. I would never hurt you like that, Lucinda. He was completely sincere with her. Saw a slight change in her expression, just maybe she believed him. He pulled her very gently into his chest and, thankfully she allowed it, leaned into him even. Nick internally breathed a sigh of relief, hopefully the worst was over, and they could talk about it when she calmed down more. I know, we're not there yet, but I do want you, and no one else. He kissed the top of her head softly and just lay there on the bed holding her gently as he could, trying as best he could to comfort her with his presence and to try not to aggravate her wounds at the same time. She just lay there quietly for a long time, though Nick knew she was not sleeping. He could feel one of her hands playing with a button on his shirt, even rips. Totally obsessed with you and Kyra. He tried teasing her lightly, trying to just get a smile out of her, even if it was tiny or with a roll of her eyes. He didn't care, just wanted to see it. Watched her as she lifted her chin and looked up at him, no smile though, still looked sad. Nick did not want to see sadness in her eyes when she looked at him. Not in those beautiful eyes. I mean every word, he said softly. Touched her face gently, it was the only part of her that wasn't covered in bruises or had any wounds. She just lay there staring up at him for the longest time. Nick didn't really know what else to say to her, so he just leaned down and kissed her softly, pressed his lips against hers to try and convey his feelings for her to her. Watched as her eyes fluttered closed, maybe it was what she needed. Nick felt her kiss him back slowly, he kept it slow and gentle, not wanting to ruin the moment. To allow her to feel what she was looking for, to kiss her, really kiss her, and not because he wanted to take it any further, just to kiss her, be with her in whatever way she needed. Pulled himself away from her, ending their kiss slowly. He didn't want to push his luck, he touched his lips to her forehead and tucked her back into his chest. Rest, sweetheart, I will stay with you. I'm sorry, she whispered to his chest. We're sorry. He heard her voice crack and felt her sob all over again, felt her bury herself into his chest, slide an arm around him, and then she held on to him, hugged into him. She believed him. No need. I understand, he murmured softly and just lay there and held onto her until she stopped crying. 64. Lucinda POV. Lucinda's eyes opened slowly. She didn't know where she was at first. The room was white and green. There was an annoying beeping sound in the room that was irritating her ears. Sounded way too loud for her liking. Her body ached everywhere, her eyes closed. Her eyes opened again, to the same room. She blinked, trying to bring it into focus. There was a smell, disinfectant, very strong. She was in the PAC hospital, she realized. On a hospital bed. She blinked slowly, trying to wake up, still felt drowsy, tried to move but couldn't, something heavy was weighing her down. She felt Kyra move inside her mind, coming back to her, and suddenly recalled what had happened. She could smell him. So strongly. Her eyes opened wide with the realization that the something heavy on her was him. She was lying in the PAC hospital on a bed and he was in that bed with her. Curled around her like nothing had happened. What was wrong with this man? She snarled. Kyra joined her, and she tried to get away from him instantly. Felt his arm tighten around her, his hand grabbed hold of hers and pinned them to her chest and keep them there so she couldn't fight him off. Kyra wasn't strong enough yet to help her. Awake, yes, but their body was badly injured and Kyra needed to work on healing them. Lucinda struggled against him. He was stronger and had his wolf, but she would not give up. Wanted away from him. Calm down. I did not cheat on you, he told her calmly. Lucinda felt the betrayal all over again. Why would he even bother or care to try and convince her of this lie? Her struggle did not stop. She tried to kick him. His leg clamped over hers and she was fully pinned up against him now. Why couldn't he just let her go? Lucinda couldn't stop the sobs that burst out of her at the pain she was feeling all over again. She struggled with all her might and will, against him and his strength which was containing her. Kyra couldn't help her, too weak at that moment. It was Lucinda's fight now, hers alone. She tried pushing against him with all she had, her wounds were screaming at her, she was injuring herself more in her attempts to get away from him and knew it. But had to try. Needed to be away from him. Enough, Lucinda. I did not cheat on you. His voice was calm but held a tone of conviction. He really was going to deny it and try to lie about it again. Try to hide it from her. She was trying with everything she had, to push his arms away to force him to release her, but he would not. Tears burned down her face. You love someone else, she sobbed out, go be with them and let me go. Pain ripped through her with every word, but it had to be said, she had to make him let her go. Once he realized she knew the truth, he would stop the act and surely release her. She could run away home, never have to see him again, ever. I do not love someone else, he told her. He just couldn't let the truth out, and continued to lie to her. Anger mixed with her pain. Liar, she screamed at him with all she had. I heard you tell them. It was my little sister. I called her. While you were in the shower. My sister Mary, I needed advice after what I did to you. Nearly marking you. Kyra whined in pain at the thought of what she had done. He sounded like he was telling the truth. Kyra wanted to believe him. Lucinda stopped struggling to turn her head and look up at him. It could be true. But she didn't know if it was. He'd told her they were really close. Would he tell her he loved her over the phone? She didn't know. Lucinda could feel that Kyra wanted to believe him, and a large part of her did too. She did not want to think her own mate would betray her. What mate would want to believe that? Nick released her from his grip, and moved her onto her back to look down at her. His blue eyes were locked right on hers. Filled with what she could only discern as concern and worry. You can ask her yourself. Check my phone call log if you want to. I told you we were very close. And yes, I told her, I love her. She's my little sister. You can understand that bond, right? Lucinda could understand that bond, she could only nod up at him. She was still sobbing, couldn't just stop, her pain had been real and it didn't just vanish in an instant. I'm sorry, Lucinda, that you thought I would do that. He brushed a few loose strands away from her face and tucked them behind her ear. His touch was light and so gentle. I would never hurt you like that. Lucinda knew he meant it. Kyra whined in pain inside her mind, nearly hurt mate. She was now upset, knowing now it was a misunderstanding. She had been ready to fight him, to hurt him, even kill him. It caused her pain. When he pulled her gently into his chest, Lucinda let him, wanted. No needed to be hugged right now. Leaned into him and breathed in his scent. Knew it would calm her down and she did need that right now. I know we're not there yet, he said softly, but I do want you and no one else. Lucinda did feel happy to hear him say that, felt the soft kiss he placed on top of her head. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to just lay in his arms and try not to think about it. How stupid she had been, how bad it could have turned out for both of them, if he'd not had her and Kyra tranquilized. Distracted herself with the button on his shirt and the thought of his tattoo on his chest, how much she really did like it. That she found herself often waking up with her head on it, his wolf's representation. Wanted to touch it. Even Rip's totally obsessed with you and Kyra. She heard his light teasing tone and wondered, after everything she and Kyra had put him through, how he could just go back to teasing her like that. Looked up at him slowly, still felt sad about her own actions towards him, how she'd not even gone to him to make him explain what she had heard him say. I mean every word he told her, and she knew he did. She was staring up at him, her mate. He was so understanding of her, she honestly didn't understand why he wasn't mad at her. If the tables had been reversed, she would have been mad that he didn't come to her demand an explanation, just tried to hurt them. When Nick leaned down and kissed her softly on the mouth, she did not pull away from him, didn't stop him. Allowed him to kiss her, felt her eyes close and kissed him back. It was a slow soft kiss that practically had her toes curling. She didn't want him to pull away, enjoyed the way he tugged so gently on her lower lip before releasing her to kiss her forehead and tuck her back into his chest. Rest, sweetheart, I will stay with you. I'm sorry. Lucinda whispered, feeling tears well up. She'd hurt him too. We're sorry. She apologized for Kyra too. She could feel how bad Kyra felt about her own actions. Now that they knew it was all a stupid mistake, all their fault, not his. Burst into tears over her own actions and what they had done to him, she curled her arm around him and hugged herself into him. Sobbed even harder when she heard him tell her no need. I understand. His voice had been soft and reassuring, just made them feel even more terrible about their actions. Nick lay there on the bed with her, his arm loosely around her while she hugged him. She did not know how long for, it was a comfortable silence. Nick. He sounded very relaxed to her. Almost sleepy. Can you please, not sedate us anymore? Now I want to say yes to that. Can you guarantee Kyra won't do anything to warrant it? Maybe, she sighed, it wasn't something she could guarantee. She'll never try to hurt you again. Good enough. She heard a smile in his voice. Lucinda looked up at him, pushed herself gently away, winced as her wounds protested. Nick released her and she sat up. He moved off the bed and grabbed a chair to sit next to her bed. She watched him for a minute and he just smiled softly at her. Lucinda turned her attention to her own body and blinked. she knew she was hurting all over the place, but to see all the bruises on her arms and legs, the wound dressings too, she pulled the hospital gown away from her body and looked down through the neck hole and bit her lip. "You don't want to see your back," Nick commented. "How bad is it?" she asked. Kyra took on a fully grown bear and, well, it injured you quite a bit. "Are they stitches?" Her eyes snapped to Nick's. Was she going to have hideous scars all over her body for the rest of her life? "Yes, and some staples as well," he nodded, "about 80 all up." "Goddess, I'm going to be scarred for life." He chuckled. "No you're not, Kyra will heal you." Lucinda frowned. She'd not been injured before, had no idea if Kyra could heal all of these wounds. "Can she?" "All of them?" "Yes, most likely, you might end up with 1 or 2 light scars, but that would be it." "Has she never healed you before?" "Never gotten injured since having her, I guess." Nick frowned at her now. "Not even when fighting rogues on border patrol?" Lucinda shrugged. "Always fine when we shift back." "You'll be fine, I'm sure." Then he smiled at her. "Do you need something for the pain?" Lucinda thought about that for a moment. "No. I'm all right. I suppose it did hurt, but not as much as she thought it would." She glanced at the clock. It was almost 7 p.m. "I've been out all day." Nick nodded at her. Lucinda bit her lip. "Nick." "Yes," he replied when she didn't go on. She sighed. This might not be the right time to ask, but, just ask Lucinda. "I want my bow back and I need to be able to train." She looked right at him. Watched him nod slowly. "I am still going to limit the number of hours you can train though. You train too much." "But I need to," she protested. Nick sighed. "Why do you need to?" "I have to prove I can keep up." "Sweetheart, you can more than keep up. Trust me." Lucinda shook her head. She must always train, needed to, so she could, when the day came, be there and save them. "But I need to, how else will I protect them?" she said softly. "Protect who?" he asked. What?" she stammered. "You said you have to protect them." "Protect who?" He was looking right at her now, a slight frown on his face. Lucinda bit her lip, only now realizing what she'd said. She'd nearly outed her pack. The very people she needed to protect. Looked down at her hands. She still wasn't ready to talk about that yet. It was difficult just thinking about it, let alone talking about it. Maybe she should get their permission first. It wasn't just her in hiding. Yes, there were her women and children, but still. Nick touched her hands. "We can talk about that when you're ready. But I do need you to do something for me, and soon." She looked at him a little dubiously. "What?" she asked a little hesitantly, wondering if he was going to ask her to let him mark her, mate her. His smirk told her he knew what she was thinking, and he shook his head. "Not that, my dear. I need you to call Alpha Corey. I got a very angry call from him today." Lucinda looked away from him and bit her lip. She'd honestly forgotten about that with everything else that was going on. I think someone put me in hot water, for no reason." "Hey," he was smiling though, and teasing her a little, trying to lighten the truth of the situation. "I'm sorry, but I thought." "I know what you thought." She saw him nod. "But it's not true. If Alpha Corey doesn't hear from you, my new father is coming to kick apparently." Lucinda giggled just a little, couldn't help it. Yes, she'd got him in trouble, but it was nice to know that Alpha Corey really would come for her if she really did need him to. "Oh, so you think that's funny, hey?" he smiled at her. "Maybe." She held up her thumb and pointer finger with a small gap between them, just like this much, then looked away from him again and bit her lips together. Nick chuckled softly and stood up. Goddess help me, you are way too much like Jeremy, you know. She looked up at him, took it as a compliment. She liked Jeremy, tried not to laugh and saw him shake his head slightly. Come on. I really don't want to have to deal with my new mother, and I just bet Corey will bring her if he comes. Lucinda snickered. Only to annoy you. Lindy would probably insist on coming. Alpha Corey likely wouldn't get a say in it. She'd put her foot down. Enough said. Do you think you can walk? How far? To the car. Then he frowned. You'll have to go into my office. Lucinda nodded at him. Okay, she was going to give him a chance and actually try after what she'd nearly done to him, and how he'd not even gotten mad at her. He deserved that much. Dr. Emerson came and gave her the all-clear to leave on the provision that she went right to her bed, and once she was healed he could come and take her stitches and staples out. That Nick was to make sure she got complete bed rest till she was fully recovered. Lucinda rolled her eyes at the grin on Nick's face at the words complete bed rest. What, it's not my fault, the doc ordered it, he chuckled. And promised the doctor he would definitely make sure she stayed in their bed. Even Dr. Emerson shook his head at Nick's tone. No funny business, Alpha, just rest, he told Nick. Lucinda smirked at him. She snorted, saved by the doctor. Nick laughed softly, promised his pack doctor he would behave himself, and she was released. Given a dress to wear, from the hospital supply room. It was a simple blue dress, and she could see most of her wound dressings and bruises. Not that there was much she could do about it, she did get a look at her back. The entire thing was black and blue, and long dressings applied to the sutured wounds. It was a short and uncomfortable drive, and she was honestly glad to get out of the car. Nick must have realized as he looked over at her several times, she'd winced a few times, his car needed better shocks. She felt every bump and every wound on her back and legs. Where they touched the seat, Nick walked her into his office, and she found herself faced with his entire Alpha unit. They were all staring at her. She really didn't know what to say to them. They would all know what had happened and why by now. She just looked down at her feet, stepped a little closer to Nick, and felt more than a little embarrassed by her actions. Nick was holding her hand in his as they walked into his office. He didn't seem bothered by them all being there at all. She just walked next to him, but didn't look at any of them. Sweet goddess, she heard Jeremy say as she walked past him. Nick, she needs to be in the hospital still. Was all he said. From here straight to our bed, doc's orders. Right, he directed at her. Lucinda nodded yes. He picked up the phone and glanced at Jeremy. He didn't know the number by heart obviously. Lucinda cleared her throat. If we're in the same state, I know it. We are, he answered her, surprised her a little. Lucinda dialed the number for Alpha Corey's office. It didn't take long for him to pick up. Nick, it's Lucinda. Alpha Corey, honey, are you okay? He asked right away. A little injured, but fine. Now please explain to me what happened. Lucinda glanced at Nick's Alpha unit and bit her lip. They all turned and filed out of the room. Jeremy closed the door behind him. It surprised her. A misunderstanding, I believe. Do you believe that? Yes. Does Kyra? Yes. Do you want me to come and get you? His tone implied he still would, she realized. No, she shook her head, but I do need to talk to you, Lindy, Gabby and James about something. While she had him on the phone, she might as well bring up her girls. Now? No, I think it will need to be an in-person thing. About? Lucinda's eyes moved to Nick. He was leaning casually on his desk watching her. The twins. She saw Nick frown slightly. I'll organize it for once you're marked and mated, not before. That shocked her completely. What? Why till then? Because I'm not expecting to see you till your Luna ceremony, is why. Oh. Go and rest, I hear you were badly injured, and then the line disconnected. Lucinda frowned, but what could she do? Nothing was what? She put the phone down. You miss the twins? Lucinda nodded, felt a large ache touch her chest and looked away from him. She'd cried enough today. I'll support whatever you want to do, about the twins, Lucinda, he told her, surprising her. Don't look so surprised, I wanted to have them come with you, but Alpha Corey told me no. That got her attention. Come on, let's get you into bed, as per Emerson's orders. Nick watched her walk to his car, seemingly uncaring about her wounds. It was very odd. She hadn't wanted pain relief at all, she had to be in pain, surely, but she didn't complain about it, hadn't really said anything about pain at all, just concerned that she was going to be scarred for life. It was really unusual for her to have never been wounded before as well, considering she was border patrol and he had seen Kyra take on many rogues, he was certain she would have. When he thought about it, he had seen her take a few hits. But Kyra had simply dismissed it and gone them all back. Nothing stopped her. Wolf, Rip. Did you see Kyra get injured that day we saw her as backup? Yes. Rip answered him. Nick was walking her with his hand on the small of her back. Though her back had massive claw marks to it, his hand, which was large and was definitely touching one of her wounds, wasn't bothering her at all. Her pain tolerance was indeed very high. He'd had lesser wounds that hurt to blazes. Soak. Rip snorted. Even our mate is tougher than you. I don't know, Rip. It's odd. Look at her, just walking around as though nothing happened, but 70% of her body is injured. Strong mate. Rip reminded him. Nick didn't like it, something else was going on. She was very uncomfortable riding in the passenger seat of his Hummer. Shifted herself multiple times on the very short ride, it was only about 500 meters, but he wasn't about to make her walk it in her condition. He needed her to call Alpha Corey and clear things up, otherwise he would just stay in the pack hospital with her. He'd helped her up into and out of his Hummer, and she hadn't seemed to mind, slipped his hand into hers, linking their fingers. And walked into the pack house. There had been a few pack members that stopped and stared at her, she'd not much noticed it or hadn't let on. He'd already let them know she'd unwittingly wandered into bear country and found herself face to face with a grizzly bear. Didn't want his pack members thinking he had done this to her, or anyone else here for that matter. That she was walking next to him, holding his hand, this would help to alleviate any doubt he hoped, as well. She actually didn't seem to mind him helping her in and out of the car, or holding her hand. Seemed to have had some sort of breakthrough. She had hugged him herself at one point in the hospital, sobbed all over him. They did feel guilty for their actions. Had not only believed him but had wanted to believe him, that much he had seen for himself, it was in the way she had looked up at him. Lucinda had also apologized for Kyra too. So it was likely that Kyra too was feeling bad. Nick knew Kyra wanted her mate. That was pretty clear from the way she had played with Rip the other day. Then to have turned on him, must cause her pain. She moved closer to him, when she'd seen his whole unit in his office, looked away from them all, couldn't look at Brady at all, it seemed. She was either completely embarrassed by her own actions or felt guilty towards them too. Nick wasn't sure which it was. Didn't ask her, would likely only make her feel even worse. Nick knew they all understood now that the reason behind her sudden bloodlust-filled rage was known to all of them. Kevin had sighed and shaken his head. Told Nick, there was no way she didn't want to not be his mate. If she reacted like that, she was already attached to him. That the betrayal she felt meant she and Kyra were as bonded to him as he was her. That was why the reaction was so severe. It did explain a lot. Considering she was so distant most of the time. Had been keeping herself emotionally closed off to him, because she hadn't wanted him to know she did actually want him. Cheeky woman. Was holding out on him. The question was why? He knew they had issues, but still couldn't they have sorted them out, while mating like crazy? It was obvious to him that she didn't want to talk to Alpha Corey, with his alpha unit in the room. A single glance at them was all it took for them to realize it too. She had glanced at them, biting her lower lip a little, and the three of them had simply filed out of his office and closed the door behind them. Nick had not even had to ask them to give her some privacy, they all just understood her look. He definitely had hand-picked himself a good unit to be around him. To help him protect this pack. Nick could hear everything that Alpha Corey asked Lucinda. His alpha hearing was picking it all up. Rip was also listening, he noted, quite intently. They were both interested in hearing the conversation. He was leaning against his desk, not interfering at all. This was her thing to sort out. When she'd asked if they were in the same state, Nick had just told her yes, he needed to really stop hiding things from her. Learn to trust her as much as she needed to learn to trust him. So he would start that now. Nick leaned on his desk just watching her. He would not interfere. He had no intentions of interrupting her or prompting her, this was for her to sort out, and if Alpha Corey thought that Nick was, in any way, guiding her or trying to coerce her with her answers, Nick knew the man would come here without a doubt. And the not alone probably meant he would be bringing his allied packs to assist in her retrieval. His pack was too small to take on Nick's alone. It was really nice to hear her tell Alpha Corey that she didn't want him to come and get her. That she was willing to stay here, a decision she had made on her own, showed Nick she was willing to be here, to try and work on their bond. Be his Luna at some point. Though he was more than curious about the twins, she wanted to talk to them all, about the twins. There was only one reason, he thought, that she missed them too much and, though she was not raising them, probably wanted them here with her. That was not going to be an easy conversation. Nick would stay out of it where possible. Support her decision but stay out of it. It was not for him to decide, but he would be willing to increase visits to weekly if need be. That would be fine with him, she loved them with all she had. He knew that, had heard for himself just how heartbreaking it had been for her to leave them behind. He could understand it, had outright refused to let his sister leave his pack, not even for her mate. Nick was just as shocked by Alpha Corey's response as Lucinda herself was. Telling her they would not be discussing it until after she was marked and mated seemed a little harsh, even to Nick. He was watching her as she just stood there staring at the phone after Alpha Corey disconnected the line. She put it down and just stared at it, frowning. Seemed very confused about his response. A little more shocked to hear that Nick had tried to get them to come here with her. If she had been raising them, they would right now be running around in his suite, hopefully not kicking him or hitting him for that matter. That little girl had held some power for an 8-year-old. Was going to be a strong warrior when older. Nick wondered if Alpha Corey had deliberately made that statement to her. Trying to hurry their bond along, in fact. Nick would not be rushing her though, and he would not be rolling around with her in their bed, trying to seduce her for a while either, not after this morning. After nearly marking and mating her against her will. He and Rip, needed to keep themselves under control and in check. He had played with her a little, in the pack hospital, about her bed rest and to his delight, had gotten her usual sarcastic eye roll, which Nick now realized he really liked. Her sarcasm seemed to be her way of trying to resist him. It was just cute to him and he was happy to see it back. At least for the next few days, that wouldn't be a problem, just looking at her hurt. So many wounds all over her, and she was black and blue everywhere. He had no intention of touching her in any way. In this condition, didn't even really cross his mind, not that she seemed to be in any pain. "Come on," he said softly, "bed." Lucinda didn't argue, just nodded up at him. He saw her eyes move past him, to the whiteboard, and her frown deepened as she looked at it, tilted her head slightly to the side and then, after a minute, glanced right at him questioningly. Nick wasn't going to hide it from her. He'd already thought the best way to figure it out was to involve her, so he wasn't going to keep it a secret, that he was investigating the man, or her past with him for that matter. "Do you know him?" she asked quietly, as Nick guided her out of the room. He and Rip both picked up the tinge of fear in her voice. She was worried that he might know Alpha Darwin. Now that could explain a lot. If she thought he knew her enemy, it would cause her to be weary of him, of being here. No. Took a lot of research this past week to find anything about him. "I'll show it to you, if you promise not to run off and hunt him down," he told her truthfully. "I won't do that," she agreed quickly. "Really?" Nick asked, not completely convinced due to the speed of her reply. "I'm not completely stupid, Nick. Besides, that was the first time I had seen him in 8 years. You are correct on that." Her statement that he was correct on that, meant that she had read the entire board, taking in all the information he'd written on there. "Who is he?" he queried. "To you?" She answered, more than a little bit of anger in her voice. Was all he said on the subject as they waited for the elevator. "Let's get you into bed and get some food into you. Kyra will need energy to heal you." "I am hungry," she nodded. She walked next to him, allowing him to hold her hand the whole way, but she was chewing on her lower lip as well, thinking. Likely thinking about Darwin. Nick didn't like it. He didn't want her thinking about that man right now. They could discuss it later. Nick handed her pajamas and allowed her to change into them in private, before setting her up in their bed with lots of pillows behind her and seeing that she was as comfortable as possible in bed with all her wounds. "Samantha will be here soon to make dinner." "Why?" she asked him. Nick smiled at her. "I'm not a good cook. Burn everything or undercook it completely." She chuckled. He liked it. "Is that why your kitchen had nothing but snack foods in it?" "Yes. Samantha tried to teach me, it didn't take. In the end, told me to get out of her kitchen, before I burned it down." He nodded. "Fair enough." Nick did not have TV or anything of entertainment value in the bedroom. He was only ever in here for sleeping. She was likely going to get bored very quickly. Though with her injuries, he doubted very much, Kyra would be up to destroying anything for a few days. The rest of the audiobook will be continued in the next episode. Join us on Patreon for early access or more great audiobooks. A link is provided in the video description.